Yes, I can. I couldn't find the link, you know. Yes, yes. Ah, I see. Are you in your office? Really? So am I. Do you have time to get a coffee and just go to the kitchen? Sorry.
Maybe Ranjan, you are not audible on the YouTube, but I'm on Google Meet. You are perfectly audible here.
Hello, Ranjanda. You are audible on Google Meet, but maybe not on YouTube. So just kindly.
Am I audible now? Am I audible now? Am I audible? No. So sorry, I have to begin this again because I wasn't audible. So it is important that I am actually heard. So we begin again. Boy, why boy? Boy is the Bangla word for book. It is also, I must say in an aside, a word for cinema in Bangla. It points to early Bengali cinema's dependence on the book for its stories. When we, by which I mean the Department of English, the University of North Bengal, began discussing the possibility of organizing a lecture series that could bring the world to our small sub-Himalayan town in Bengal, we began with ideas and metaphors. And at one point, both came together. The world had traveled to places like ours through books, and it is through books that we had made our first international travels. What better than Bowie, the book then, to commemorate that heritage of old travel and link it to our own new travels on the internet? Like the pages of a Bowie, where writer meets reader, this lecture series will be a meeting place for the reader and the writer. The featured author will speak about one of their books and in the process introduce us to their mind and the context that have produced it. We will announce the title of the book in advance so that interested readers can get acquainted with the boy that will be discussed by its author. This will allow for an engaged discussion after the author's talk. Since I am on the subject already, here are a few housekeeping guidelines. The author will speak for about 45 minutes, and this will be followed by about half an hour of discussion around the featured book. You can type your questions in comments, and our team will collect them to ask the author after their talk. While we hope that our students learn to articulate their thoughts as they see these fascinating minds at work, I hope the Boy Lecture Series, which will feature books that have impacted the field and changed the humanities, will also be of interest to anyone who has picked up a book and looked at it with wonder, imagining how it came to be. Our boy speaker today is Catherine Malabou, one of the finest philosophers of our times. She is a professor in the philosophy department at the Center for Research in Modern European Philosophy at Kingston University, at the European Graduate School, and in the Department of Comparative Literature at the University of California, Irvine, a position formerly held by Jacques Derrida. Among her many books include Self and Emotional Life, Merging Philosophy, Psychoanalysis, and Neuroscience with Arian Johnston, Columbia University Press 2013, You Be My Body for Me for Corporative Plasticity in Hegel's Phenomenology of Spirit, Plasticity at the Dusk of Writing, Dialectic Destruction, Deconstruction, Columbia University Press 2009, The New Wounded, From Neurosis to Brain Damage, Fordham University Press 2012, Counterpath, Traveling with Jacques Derrida, Stanford University Press, 2004. The Future of Hegel, Plasticity, Temporality and Dialectic, Routledge, 2004. The lecture today will pivot around her book, Before Tomorrow, Epigenesis and Rationality, Cambridge Polity, 2016, with thoughts on Kant, epigenesis, textuality, textualism, and other allied issues. We are deeply honored to have you with us in this distinguished lecture series. Over to Professor Malabou.
Well, thank you so much, Ranjan. And first of all, it was a beautiful introduction, and I'm very pleased and honored myself to inaugurate this series. So thank you so much to your department, your colleagues, and all the staff for organizing this series. So as Professor Ghosh just recalled, as I was asked to present on one of my books, I chose this one. So as Professor Ghosh just reminded us, Before Tomorrow. And the subtitle is Epigenesis and Rationality. And in this book, very briefly, I developed a possible new interpretation of Kant, the German philosopher, based on one of his metaphors, a metaphor that he uses in the Critique of Pure Reason at paragraph 27, where he says, we have to build an epigenesis of pure reason. And I was very intrigued by this metaphor, epigenesis of pure reason, and I developed a whole interpretation of it in the book. So today, I won't repeat what I said in the book, but what I would like to do is to develop this idea of epigenesis in order to show that it can become a new paradigm for philosophy, but not only for philosophy, but also for hermeneutics and politics today. So I will show that epigenesis can become this new paradigm, and I want to do it in line with my concept of plasticity that I developed before. Epigenesis, as I will try to show, is a follow-up of plasticity. So we have to think them together, plasticity and epigenesis. So without further ado, let me start. So I want to apologize in advance for my references to be very Western, because it will be Kant, but also a French philosopher, Paul Ricoeur. But I hope that in the way I will present, you will understand what is at stake. That, in my opinion, is wider than just the Western world. So let me start by making 4 points before explaining what relates them in an essential way. At stake is the possibility of sketching new crossings between philosophy, contemporary biology, textual and political practices. So if epigenesis is a new paradigm, it would bring together biology, philosophy, hermeneutics, and politics. So what are these 4 points? First, a definition of epigenesis. So the term epigenesis comes from the Greek epi, which means above, and genesis, which means genesis or constitution. So in the beginning, epigenesis referred to a mode of embryonic development through the successive addition of parts that form and are born from one another. It's the model for a model of explanation of the living being. Aristotle, the Greek philosopher, uses the term epigenesis for the first time in Greece in his book Generation of Animals to refer to the formation of the living individual. Modern usage of the term begins in 1650 with the English biologist William Harvey, who, in his book called On the Generation of Animals, presents epigenesis as characteristic of an organism, I quote, in which all parts are not fashioned simultaneously, but emerge in their due succession and order. So we see immediately the link between epigenesis and plasticity, that is the formation of a form that is not preformed, but on the contrary, that evolves through time. And that's why in the 18th century, precisely, there was a big quarrel in biology between scientists who defended that idea of a gradual formation of the living being and other biologists, who, on the contrary, advocated the idea that the embryo was already preformed in the womb. So epigenesis is, once again, a theory of growth and the formation of the form. It is a theory of plasticity. Second point, briefly, Kant. So as I said in my introduction, in paragraph 27 of the Critique of Pure Reason, Kant makes use of the expression that I call the metaphor, epigenesis of pure reason. So what is it about? Paragraph 27 is part of what is called the transcendental deduction, in which Kant exposes the question of the origin of the necessity of the agreement that connects the categories to the objects of experience a priori. The question is, where do our logical categories come from? How can we explain that we have in our minds, a series of preset categories like necessity, causality, quantity, quality, etc. And how, if they are in our mind, how can they agree, hence the problem of the agreement, with the objects of nature, of experience? So Kant says there are two possibilities. These categories are either innate, that is, they are preformed in the mind, or they come from experience itself. They are a posteriori. But Kant says none of these two possibilities is satisfactory. There must be a middle way. That is, the categories are, in a certain sense, preset in the mind, but at the same time, they are not innate. They cannot come from experience, because we are not learning what causality is, etc. The frame is present in our minds, and at the same time, these categories cannot be innate. So we have to suppose, at the very level of logic, a kind of growth of the categories, something between innateness and experience. And this is where it introduces epigenesis. So if we refer to what I was saying a moment ago, like in biology, this theory of plastic formation of the living being, Kant uses it to characterize something that is not at all biological, but on the contrary transcendental, something that is quite abstract, but very surprisingly and interestingly, he associates the development of the categories in the mind to a biological epigenesis. Third point, the move from epigenesis to epigenetics. So epigenetics, which is much more contemporary, is a neologism that was created in 1940 by the British biologist Conrad Waddington. And of course, epigenetics derives from epigenesis. So what is epigenetics? The noun epigenetics refers to the branch of molecular biology that studies the relations between genes and the individual features they produce, that is, the relation between the genotype, that is the DNA, and the phenotype, that is each of us, the individual physical bodies that we are. Reflecting on the creation of this term in 1968, Waddington commented, I quote, "Some years ago, I introduced the word epigenetics, derived from the Aristotelian word epigenesis, which had more or less passed into disuse, as a suitable name for the branch of biology which studies the causal interactions between genes and their products, which bring the phenotype into being. The adjective epigenetic refers to everything to do with this interaction and is concerned with the mechanisms of expression and transcription of the genetic code. So epigenetics has become a predominant science today. Even more important, some biologists say, than genetics. And epigenetics is studying precisely the mechanisms that translate the DNA into the RNA. That is, the mechanisms that form the individuals that we are. And just an allusion to the situation today, the new vaccine, for example, the Pfizer vaccine, is grounded in this use of the RNA in order to boost people's immunity. So epigenetics, what I call the new epigenetic vaccines, we can see this is another example of how important this new science is. So and I will, of course, come back to this relationship between epigenetics and genetic. So here also you see the importance of plastic formation between the DNA that is rigid and the formation of the individual. And last point, fourth point, hermeneutics. So this is where I have to refer to a French philosopher who is Paul Ricoeur. And what is interesting in his work is that he uses the term epigenesis as an exegetical, that is hermeneutical tool, and an instrument of reading that allows him to question the problem of signification or meaning in a very specific way. What is epigenesis in the hermeneutical context? Ricoeur provides us, first of all, with a negative definition. He says an epigenesis is not a genesis. There is, in the beginning, I said epigenesis and genesis are one and the same. Ricoeur says no, not exactly, because genesis is a way to look back to an origin, rather than epigenesis is a middle point between memory, that is a way of looking back at the origin, and projecting onto the future. So for Ricoeur, epigenesis marks the current meeting point between the old and the new, the space where they reciprocally interfere and transform one another, the embryo of a specific temporality. So if I summarize the 4 points, we have with epigenesis a plastic model that interrogates the plasticity of the living being, the formation of the individual, the plasticity of the origin of the categories in our mind, the plasticity of the interpretation of the DNA, and the plasticity of our reading and understanding. So how can we reunify all these points? Let's come back to the etymology of epigenesis. We recall that the prefix epi means above. So epigenesis, therefore, literally means above Genesis, that is, over it. This literal meaning is very difficult to understand initially, because what can an over Genesis mean? To clarify, we often transform the above into an after. Isn't epigenesis just a development that follows a first genesis, a first source, one that takes off from it? In fact, we have to examine this above a little more closely and turn to another domain of explanation. Look at what happens at the level of the Earth. The geological, there's another meaning of the epi, that is geological, and we should add this to our 4 points. We would have to add a 5th point, because when we look at the geological meaning of the prefix epi, it is very illuminating and comes to our rescue in order to understand what this epi means. It helps us understand the above not as an extension that comes over something else, but as a surface effect. In geology, the epicenter is the point of projection of the hypocenter, the underground site where an upheaval emerges upon the surface of the Earth. Let's think of an earthquake. What is an earthquake? An earthquake has a hypocenter, which is deep down in the ground. But when it explodes at the epicenter, which is at the surface. So the epicenter lies exactly on the vertical line of the underground focus. So the work of determining the position of the epicenter, the place where destruction is the greatest, is called localization. So from there, from this explosive plasticity, the point where something explodes at the surface of the Earth, we can deduce that all epigenesis, that is not only the geological one, but also the epigenetic, the hermeneutical, etc., all epigenesis perhaps comes to light starting from a focus corresponding to the hypocenter, something that explodes at the surface, that perhaps has grounds in the very deep in the ground, but this memory, this ground, we don't have access to. So epigenesis forces us to get interested in the notion of the surface, what happens at the surface. And in that sense, we can say that, yes, Paul Ricoeur is right, epigenesis is not genesis. To own up to its own logic, it is necessary to remain on the surface in some way. And this does not mean being superficial, but rather working where it occurs. That is, at the contact point between the underground and the ground. So I think what we have to do today, if we extend these metaphors to the political situation in which we are, we should be able, in any case, to locate the epicenter of each phenomenon and remain at the point of impact. Determine where and when the events affect us. And they affect us at the surface, and we can come back to that in the discussion. We must conclude then that, as Kant himself suggests, the seat of reason, what Kant calls rationality, reason, should not be sought below, should not be sought in the ground. We should not look for roots of a phenomenon, but on the contrary, we should look for anything rational. We should situate rationality as the quest for the surface and give up all attempt at finding the hidden ground or the hidden reason for a phenomenon. So all the metaphors of epigenesis convey the idea of a founding at the point of contact and not by the root or focus. The challenge is then to understand how a surface can be foundational and to what extent epigenesis can prove to be more fruitful than genesis. And for this, I will go back to Ricoeur. As we just saw for him, epigenesis situates itself in the middle at the contact point and is in the process of bringing to fruition the fusion of times, past and future. In that sense, epigenesis is then both spatial, the surface, and temporal, the point of contact between the past and the future. In order to make that clearer, Ricoeur uses he brings together two times that he takes from philosophy. First, Freud, and second, Hegel. He says epigenesis in hermeneutics should be the contact point between Freud and Hegel. Why that? What does that mean? Freud, as you know, is looking for the hidden ground of all phenomena. This hidden ground is the unconscious. On the contrary, Hegel is affirming that everything that is in constant transformation. And dialectics is a logic of constant transformation. And Ricoeur says, precisely, epigenesis is just at the meeting point between the deep archaic origin of all phenomena, between the unconscious and consciousness that is always in the process of its own transformation. So maybe that would change the theory I developed in my PhD, because at the time I thought that plasticity always happened at the level of consciousness, that is, in this constant process of transformation, change, the way in which consciousness is fashioned by its own future. And now, with this model of epigenesis, I think that things are more complicated. I think that plasticity is a mix between the unconscious and conscious. I mean, between the unconscious and the conscious apprehension of space and time. That's why epigenesis then appears as the intersection, the meeting point, once again, of the archaic, that is the archive, and the future, or the teleological. So, meaning, and by meaning, I mean rationality, biology, hermeneutics, and politics, lies in the medium point between the pure repetition of the archaic, of the unconscious, and the dissolution of the archaic in a constant dialectical sublation of the past. Then plasticity would be the repetition of the identical and the destruction of the identical. And epigenetic reading, and I think this is important for our series, because it's about books and reading, epigenetic reading defines itself as a prospecting tension between the future. I'm sorry, I have a problem with my light. Prospecting tension towards the future, which rectifies after the fact the primitive or archaic dispositions that made it possible. I would like, so this was a way to present the epigenesis as a paradigm, but I would like to now focus more on epigenetics, I mean the biological dimension of epigenesis. So the prefix epi, you remember the meeting point, the epicenter, is illuminated in an entirely remarkable manner at this point, since epigenetics, as I said a moment ago, studies the mechanisms that modify the function of genes by activating or deactivating them. Insofar as these modifications never alter the DNA sequence itself, epigenetics is said to work on the surface, epi, of the molecule. And once again, this is the way in which the Pfizer vaccine is working. People sometimes express their fears that this vaccine might alter the DNA. In fact, no, because it is an epigenetic vaccine. So this meaning of surface, we find again in this science, epigenetics. Epigenetics actually studies the transformation mechanisms at work on the surface of the DNA molecule during its transcription. While epigenetics has a wide field of action, it doesn't have any impact on the code. So it is striking that the complex relationship between the genetic and the epigenetic is very close to what I was saying a moment ago about time. Genetic would be the archaic, I mean the deep memory of species, and the epigenetic would be the future, that is the way in which, at the surface of the archaic, at the surface of the DNA, new mechanisms of transcription happen that determine the the birth of new beings. So the rise of epigenetics that has become, as I said, a predominant science, largely derives from the results of the sequencing of the human genome in 2001. At the time, in the around this time, 2000, 2001, people were hoping, scientists were hoping that by sequencing the human genome, they would discover that all our conduct, all our behaviors were determined by specific genes, and that we could explain everything by referring to the DNA. On the contrary, and this places us back to a very similar situation than that of Kant. Do we have to refer to everything innate? And in fact, what they discovered when the genome was sequenced, that it was quite the contrary, that the human genome is made up of only 30,000 genes, and that only 5% of this genome is coding. Assembled in bunches and clusters, the coding genes are separated by vast expanses of so-called gene deserts made up of DNA called junk that is non-coding. So only a very few portion of our genome is coding, which means that a lot of our behaviors, a lot of our biological determinations are not genetically programmed. So there's a French scientist, Atlan, who wrote a book called The Emergence of the Epigenetic Paradigm, in which he says the idea that everything is genetic is starting to be seriously unsettled. Let me quote more at length what he says. During the last 40 or 50 years, the classical idea that seeks to explain very complex observations by reducing them to laws or simple mechanisms appear to have been attained in biology thanks to the discovery of the genetic code and its universality. This was truly an extraordinary discovery that ought to have led to the invariable law underlying all biological processes. As such, a genetic reductionism, crowned with success, appeared to be in sight, and the achievement of the sequencing of the human genome was assumed to meet this expectation. In fact, the completion of this project showed that everything was not written in DNA sequences, even at the molecular and cellular level. The idea that the totality of the development and functioning of living organisms is determined by a genetic program tends to be gradually replaced by a more complex model that is based on notions of interaction, reciprocal effect between the genetic, whose central role is not denied, and the epigenetic, whose importance we are gradually discovering. So once again, sorry for this long quote, but I think it explains very, very clearly what is at stake, which is the disappointment generated by the sequencing of the genome, that only a very little portion of our genes is coding, and on the contrary, the importance of the epigenetic paradigm. And once again, you see this interaction between the past. He says the genetic is very important, of course, the past and the future, and that is how epigenetic processes are acting in the absence of genetic determination, and there's a combination between this species memory and the formation of new individuals. So another discovery in biology is very important, is that these epigenetic mechanisms are, of course, internal chemical mechanisms, but they also have another type of cause. They are also determined by the environment. So epigenetic mechanisms are caused by internal processes, but also by the environment. So many geneticists now think that the behavior of genes can be modified by life experiences. An important element in epigenetic factors, in fact, derives from the environment, the outside, and like we see in brain epigenesis, by learning, environment, habit, etc. So that's why the American biologist Mary Jane West Eberhard speaks of a plasticity of the genome. This theory of the formation of the biological individual by the environment is also central in the brain because thanks to the theory called epigenesis by synaptic stabilization, we see that everything that happens in the brain, so the brain is of course genetically programmed when we think of the different regions, but then the functioning of the brain is epigenetic, which means that it evolves thanks to the environment every day, and it works by stabilization, progressive stabilization of the synapses. And this is the opposite of innatism, which means that our brain is like a text. We can say what we were saying about the text with Rika. We can say exactly the same thing about the brain. So you see, every time there's a common model, which is the memory, the archive, in the case of the brain, the genetically determined structure of the brain. So the archive, and at the same time, the modification, the evolution of something that was not contained in the archive. And what is interesting, once again, is the point of surface, is the point of contact between these two dimensions. And this is, once again, this point of contact that I now call plasticity. So the idea of such a process, this interaction, dynamic interaction between past and future, is all at once transcendental, biological, and hermeneutical. I think that one of the main tasks for critical theory and philosophy today is, according to me, to inscribe within their own field the resources provided by current cellular, molecular, and neurobiology. I do think that we are witnessing the birth of the epigenetic paradigm, which again is not pregnant only in biology, but is also an invaluable resource for the humanity. So in conclusion, I just want to focus on this notion of paradigm. Paradigm, as we know, is a term that is borrowed from Thomas Kuhn, and it designates, a paradigm is, I quote Kuhn, a set of ideas, concepts that form a framework in which to imagine, plan experiments, interpret results, develop theories. So a paradigm is a set of ideas, concepts that form a framework in which to imagine, plan experiments, interpret results, develop theories. So that's why I allowed myself to enlarge this notion of epigenetic paradigms to a whole series of disciplines today. So today, clearly, the genetic paradigm is under reconsideration. That is, that the notions that are gradually disappearing are the notions of program, predestination, and determinism. So we are living in a new temporality that elaborates itself out of the, let's say, challenging of the archive. It departs from the archive, it departs from the deep past, and at the same time, it challenges it and almost destroys it as it forms itself. So I now conclude. Epigenesis takes place at the moving contact points between origin and the future until their difference disappears right into their contact. That is something between a tensed origin, a retrospective present, and future in the making. This new figure is neither a pure product from outside nor the revelation of a preformed meaning. The logic of epigenesis, its own dynamic, requires that we seek out and show this place where a structure, be it a brain, a text, a transcendental set of categories, is both archaic in origin and susceptible of an indefinite creation of meaning. And if it is impossible to really differentiate between the transcendental, the biological, and the hermeneutical, we may affirm that what emerges today is a new form, not only of development, but also and consequently of history. We have to rediscover what living at the surface of the earth means. That is, finding the right contact points between the underground and the sky. The earth today is the political epigenetic site of our lives. The earth as the big ecosystem of our new temporality. Thank you very much. I'm done.
Thank you very much, Catherine. Thank you very much. It really covers lot of areas and I do feel that there will be questions coming from different quarters now because as I can see that you covered the areas of hermeneutics, you covered, of course, the whole question of identity. Then you try to bring up the paradigms of brain studies alongside phenoplasty and the rest of the things. Also that I think the whole idea of how this whole question of looking at nature and identity can really be questioned through epigenesis, and how detonating, how powerful can this prefix be when you say genesis and when you put epi to it, how powerful. So we have been getting a few questions, and the first question that I see here is somebody is asking me about what actually do you mean by epigenetic vaccine? I mean, that's where the whole question comes up about how do you see the relationship between COVID virus and probably epigenesis. And I had the pleasure of reading your piece on the COVID in Critical Inquiries in the Moment. And alongside Bruno Latour and Dipesh Chakraborty, you people wrote very short essays on critical inquiries in the moment. So,
yes. Yes, thank you very much. So this the piece I wrote in Critical Inquiry was more about what is it to be on one's own when we are quarantined and when we are isolated from the rest of the world. What is going on in our mind? So it's different from perhaps the problem of the because I recently also wrote a short text about the vaccine. So there's today. Well, I'm not a specialist, so I will talk generally. But what I could understand is that there are two competitive ways of about vaccination theory. The classical one, which is that we inject in the body the concentrate of the virus, and we, let's say, habituate the organism to react to, in fact, get used to this virus, and immunization comes from the habit of that. This is the classical vision of immunization, injecting the enemy's body into your body. But the Pfizer, the other camp, let's say, the other party, the Pfizer people have another view, which is working by using people's RNA to using epigenetic mechanisms based on their RNA to counter the virus's RNA. So it's a fight between the two RNAs. So immunization works, if we go back to the metaphor, at the surface of the two RNAs, the virus's one and ours. So I can't go too far in the description of that, but it's quite a different mode of acting, because the virus is not injected into your body. Yeah? It is just a genetic manipulation, if you want. So I see there's another, if our innateness are challenged, as you say, how do you see the concept of identity? So this is a very interesting question. In fact, I do see, I think that something like identity can appear when precisely there's no innateness. Because this is what Kant says in the Critique of Pure Reason. If everything is innate, then we don't have anything to do. That is, of course, we can say we have an identity that is predestined, preformed, but then we have nothing to do. I mean, there's no plastic formation of our identity, which means that perhaps this is not an identity. Because an identity, at least for me, is something that we construct. If it is pre-given, then it is totally out of our responsibility. We would not be responsible for who we are. So I would say that precisely it is the absence of innateness that makes the concept of identity possible. Can epigenetic model that suggest influence the way we look at secular of our understanding of cosmopolitanism? So, epigenetic and cosmopolitanism, this is very interesting. And I think this is totally true. This is a very good question, because in fact, when Kant is bringing to light this model of epigenesis in the Critique, he has in mind his future text on cosmopolitanism. You know that he has a text on that. And I wonder if he's not the inventor, more or less, of the term, which is that for him already, living in this world with others, this cosmopolitanism, that is the enlargement of our private world to the global one, is a problem of surface. That is that peace, for example, has to happen at the surface, that is at the point of contact between people. We cannot derive political principles from a very deep ground. We have to create our political emancipations and our political community and ways of being together at the surface. That is the meeting point between the future and the past. So thank you for question number 4. Would trauma be genetic or epigenetic? Well, so this is a very difficult question. If you allow me, I would like to go back to Freud for that. There's a very clear evolution in Freud about that. And it appears in his book, he answers your question in his book, Moses and Monotheism, in which he says, yes, there is something like a genetic trauma in the sense that humanity is imprinted with a trauma. And this trauma is the loss of the father. And that's why at each generation, children repeat the Oedipian complex, the Oedipal complex, sorry. So there's the repetition of something that has never been experienced in life. So in that sense, we might say that trauma is genetic, an imprint with no origin, totally predestined and happening at each generation. But at the same time, Freud says, and this is the very end of Moses and monotheism, he says, at the same time, I'm becoming more and more a Lamarckian, that is a transformationist, because he says, I think that in this way of repeating the trauma, each of us is changing it at the same time. That in fact, we all inherit the same type of trauma, and at the same time, we hermeneutically, precisely epigenetically, develop a personal, individual vision of it. So I would say that a trauma is precisely both, and perhaps happens at the surface, between the genetic and the epigenetic, at the meeting point. This would be my answer. And thank you for this question.
Catherine, there are a few questions coming as well. I mean, these questions I'm going to read out for you.
Okay.
One question comes from Kashir Museki, and the question is that epigenetics, as you said, do not change genetic makeup. How about epigenesis changing the innate conceptions or surface changing unconscious? And how do we place changing desire vis-a-vis unconscious?
So this is about psychoanalysis, am I right?
Yeah,
Ranjan?
I think so. There is another question from Aristotle as well, which I'm going to read out after you finish here.
Okay. So yes, thank you very much. So, well, in a certain sense, I already answered about the trauma, but thank you for this question. You know, if I just mentioned brain epigenesis, it is because I think that psychoanalysis has to open itself to neurology. Because there is the unconscious, this is true, as Freud defined it, but there's also what happens in the brain. And I think that the way in which our brain functions is an interpretation of the unconscious. It is impossible today, at least this is my contention. I know this is very controversial, but for me, it is impossible to just affirm there's the unconscious, okay? There is the unconscious, this is true, of course. I would not challenge that. But at the same time, there's the way in which our brain processes the unconscious, and this in relation with our education, our environment, our, all the influences we receive from outside. So this is how I would answer your question, that is by creating the point of contact between psychoanalysis and neurology.
There is another question, Catherine, from Orko Chattopadhyay, who himself is a psychoanalyst and a theorist. And he has this question. He says that I was wondering how this thinking on the surface can have a dialogue with psyche as social surface in Lacanian psychoanalysis, or rather in another way of asking, that is to inquire about the relation between psychic writing and neuronal writing in the brain.
So I think there are two, thank you very much, this is a beautiful question, but I think there are two questions in one, which is Lacan on the one hand, and then the writing, the question on the writing. So with Lacan, on Lacan, I will be very brief. There has always been a clear refusal in Lacan of any kind of biological explanation of the unconscious. So I would not be able to answer your question about Lacan from the point of view of epigenesis, because Lacan always said there's one thing we have to do is to de-biologize, in a certain sense, the unconscious. And this was against Freud, who, as you know, was a neurologist in the beginning. So Lacan is not a good help, in my view, to deal with those questions. The second point, which is very interesting, is there an interaction between, let's say, psychic writing that is all the problematic of traces, as Freud understands them, and this early on in his writing on the brain precisely. So is there a coincidence, a correspondence between the, yes, psychic memories, psychic traces, and synaptic traces? That is the way in which the neurons are forming themselves out of the influences of activities, cognitive activities, but also environments, etc. Is there a possible coincidence between psychic traces and synaptic traces? As you know, because you are a psychoanalyst, this is a very controversial point. I do think that they are yes, there is an intimate correspondence between them, absolutely. And that today, once again, I think it is impossible to isolate them. And yes.
Okay. There comes another question which says that about the ontology of the accident. And it says that, could you please elaborate how your concept of destructive plasticity or explosive plasticity influences the process of epigenesis?
So yes, thank you so much. So yes, you're right to remind the two meanings of plasticity that I just evoked in my talk, but too briefly, which is constructive, the formation of the form, and destructive, the explosion of form. So of course, the metaphor of the earthquake was an allusion to my ontology of the accident. That is that all emergence of form is at the same time a destruction of form. So this is what happens in an earthquake, but more generally, epigenesis contains this destructive plasticity to the extent that the gradual formation of form is both a construction and a destruction of the roots. Working at the surface means, of course, working from the point of view of the memory, the archive, but at the same time destroying the archive in order not to be smashed by it. It's the way in which Nietzsche had already this vision that we have to make the past explode in order to be able to open ourselves to the future. So this is what I would answer at that point.
Okay. There is something more interesting coming up. Maybe a couple of questions more for you, Catherine, if you don't mind.
No, of course.
Yeah, one thing is that one question comes from Ronjit Roy, who says that, do you believe that epigenetic turn is somehow inviting a future more disrupting and human, and this is leading us to a time where tendencies of life are more intrinsic and atavistic? Now that is interesting.
Alive are more, sorry, Ranjan?
I will repeat the question for you.
Yeah, so, yes, thank you.
Yeah, do you believe that epigenetic turn is somehow inviting a future more disrupting and inhuman, and this is leading us to a time when tendencies of life are more intrinsic and atavistic?
Yes, absolutely. I mean, I would have liked to develop more on the time, on the notion of time. That yes, I mean, if the epigenetic paradigm has any value, it would be a theory of future. That is, as you said, much more explosive, much more risky, much more unpredictable. Because, in fact, if we go back to the metaphor of the earthquake, the hypocenter, that is what happens on the ground, is always predictable. When scientists analyze an earthquake, they are able to tell what happens deep inside the earth. They are able to determine the geological causes of the earthquake. But what cannot be explained is why it explodes at that point. That is, the epicenter is not predictable. So the deep causes are predictable, but their effects at the surface are unpredictable. So yes, absolutely. It means that We can always explain everything by deep causes. For example, what happens today with the pandemics, we can give a lot of reasons. We can give a lot of explanations, but why it happened at the surface, here and there, why in China? Did it happen in China? We don't even really know. Why is something happening at this point at the surface? We can know the causes, but we cannot explain the effect. So yes, absolutely. I'm sorry, it was a metaphorical answer, but this is how I would answer.
Okay. Just a last question for you, Catherine. I mean, hopefully that's the last one because that's what I've got. I think there is a lot of interest. There is one more question.
Yes, I see the
Yeah,
second
yeah.
one, but yeah.
It's in your chat box. You can just have a look.
Is it the Ashish Sengupta?
Yes, he
Okay.
from my faculty, Professor Shengupta. Yes. Yeah.
Hello, Professor. Thank you. To find a point of contact between the ends of a working spectrum, you keep Freud at one and Hegel at the other. But isn't Hegel's project finally teleological, the pursuit of absolute knowledge? I fully agree with your understanding of the surface as the very site of occurrence where we need to situate rationality. So thank you very much, Professor. But you may know that I don't share this vision of Hegel. Yes, of course, Hegel is theological, the system, the pursuit of absolute knowledge, but he is the inventor of plasticity at the same time. He's the one who inscribed plasticity at the heart of the philosophical subject. So you see, Hegel is very ambivalent. I agree with you that there's this theological movement that is something coming from the ground, something coming from the genetic, we would say. But at the same time, there's the destruction of this model, because he says he's the first to say that the human subject is, the subject in general, is plastic, that is able to transform itself.
Thank you very much, Professor Dada.
Thank you for your question. It was a beautiful question.
You're welcome.
Catherine, here's another. I think there's an interesting questions coming up. I mean, one, there are a few questions that center around the one that you said about genes being considered as text. I mean, how do you see the relationship between gene and a text, or rather, geneticism and textualism? Probably how would
and textuality.
Yes.
Yes, this is an important point. I should have developed more on that. You know, this metaphor, in fact, I did not invent it. I found it in an article from Austrian geneticist Thomas Genovine, who has a kind of explanatory article about epigenetics. What is epigenetics? Because he works in a center for epigenetics in Vienna. And he says, okay, if we want to understand simply what epigenetics is, we have to compare it with a book, with what happens with a book and the reading of a book. He says genes are comparable to the book, and epigenetic mechanisms are comparable to interpretations of the book. And he repeats the metaphor with the musical score and interpretations of the scores. And he says this is what happens between genetics and epigenetics. And I found that very interesting. This dialectics, we can say, between something that is written, and the DNA, as we know, is a series of letters, and the interpretations of these letters. Because perhaps it is not a metaphor. Perhaps this is the way in which we read. Perhaps this metaphor used by Genovine is for us, professors in humanities, a real instrument. That what we do is that we transform the genes of our languages the genetic givenness of, yes, our languages into a personal, into individual, stylized compositions, that we invent new languages out of our initial ones. So it became interesting for me to circulate between the metaphorical and the proper, using Genovine's metaphors in order to form a theory of the text.
Well, I think this is going to be a fitting question to end this event today, and that question is, of course, is why did you title your book, or what is the significance of the title of your book, Before Tomorrow? It's a fantastic title. Believe me, I just in love with this title when I read your book. I really was fascinated by it. So maybe this is also a very concerted question from lots of people here asking, what is before tomorrow for you?
So before tomorrow, I suppose that now you understand the relation between this title and what I tried to explain, which is the point of contact, between yesterday and tomorrow. The point of contact between yesterday and tomorrow is neither one. It's not yesterday, it's not tomorrow. It is at the contact point of both. And this is what the before means. This second, I don't know, this very brief lapse of time that separates yesterday from tomorrow, which is not exactly the present either, which is the point of junction between the three dimensions of time, past, present, and future. So you asked me, what is tomorrow for me? I would be very pretentious if I could give an answer. Maybe what I tried to do in my work until now is to fluidify, what I call sometimes plastify the concept of time by erasing the frontiers between disciplines that were too rigidly separated until now, that are once again biology, philosophy, and literature, everything that pertains to language, and also psychoanalysis, of course. So bringing together the brain, the psyche, language, and thinking, thought with philosophy, and trying to put them all together in this very brief instant between yesterday and tomorrow. So I don't have an answer about what is tomorrow for me, because I have no idea. But what I can say is I try to situate myself, at the very edge of the cliff, trying to determine how far we can go before tomorrow, at the very points where tomorrow will happen.
Well, that's a very typically philosophical answer to really end this event. But I can tell you that on a very lighter note, for me, the tomorrow for me is that you will be coming again on this event after you finish writing your next book. Because what we really do here, is that we have had a wonderful present with you today. And
really,
we all have had a wonderful present with you. It was a fascinating talk that you treated us to. But we also look forward to having you again tomorrow, because I know that you are working on this book and you're heavily engrossed with that. So on that anticipatory note rather, we look forward to another wonderful tomorrow with you the next time.
Well, thank you so much, Professor Agosh. It was a very nice experience, a bit frustrating, because I would have liked to see you all, of course, but it was very refreshing for me, forcing me to, remember what I was doing in that book, what I did in that book. So thank you very much. And
And one thing,
congratulations for this.
yes, and
Yes.
one last thing is that the plasticity of this talk is going to continue for long. That is.
Thank you so much. Thank you so much.
Thank you very
Bye
much.
bye. Thank you very much. And thank you to all of you for your questions.
Thank you very much. Thank you.
Light